Go ahead and get started here. I think we barely have a quorum, and about 8 people. So we do have a little bit of housekeeping here. Everybody's on their seats. And so we've gone over kind of logistics for the tour this afternoon for going to the research station. We also have an optional tour tomorrow, going to a wood processing unit. Is Amy, would you like to give us some information on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, Amy Henderson, Waterville Growers Association. Everyone is invited to come down at your leisure to the wool mill after the meeting tomorrow. It's in Buffalo. It's if you take 16, like you're going east towards I-80. It's where the I-90. Sorry. Long ways to get to I-90. So I-90, it's where the stockyards are, on the right-hand side. If you turn right where the visitor center, take you right on there, and they'll be happy to give you a tour and kind of show you what they're doing there and how they've grown and all of the projects that they're working on. Really it's a great way to see what happens to the wool that we grow. Thank you.
Right, so if somebody's interested, I can go on that. They can talk to you first.
Yeah, just let me know because that just helps them plan as to how many people to expect. I think we've got 2 or 3 people have already indicated. Representative Larson and Representative Costin, or Senator Costin, have also indicated that they're interested in coming. So,
Representative Cassidy.
Mr. Chairman, it is a very interesting and worthwhile tour to see. They take all wool right off the sheep's back and comes out the other end, and they're making sweaters. So it's really something worth seeing. It's quite a process that they're doing. They're making yarn to sell, socks and all stuff, but they are starting to make saddle blankets. But they take wool off the sheep's back and make a sweater. It's a neat process.
Great. So it's probably take about an hour to get there. Is that?
it's about 30 minutes.
All right. So I think the general plan would be if we'll meet there for those who are interested about an hour after adjournment tomorrow, and we'll just go from there. Our registry, which is of course our thank you, Amy, for setting that up and representing Passport. Okay, now we are. It's about 1:15, so we're going to go ahead and get started here with the continuing invasive species discussion. Next up, we have the U.S. Forest Service to talk about their efforts in this area of the state, especially, and perhaps we can learn about some opportunities to work together.
Thank you. Chairman Bonner, members of the committee, good afternoon and welcome to Sheridan. Andrew Johnson, the Forest Supervisor of the National Forest based here at Sheridan. And I'm here to represent Brian Farabee, the Rocky Mountain Regional Forester. So thank you for the opportunity to come before you today and talk about invasive species management. In Wyoming, the Rocky Mountain region of the USDA Forest Service oversees management of the Bighorn, Shoshone, Black Hills, Medicine Bow National Forests, as well as the Thunder Basin National Grassland. We're honored to have public land management responsibilities across Wyoming. I appreciate the close working relationships we have with you, your constituents, and our county commissioners. Our employees live and work in communities across this great state. The USDA Forest Service is your neighbor and partner, and it's a privilege to work alongside you to maintain the state's landscapes and natural resources. The national forests and grasslands provide many benefits to communities throughout the state of Wyoming, including hunting, fishing, hiking, skiing, camping, clean water, timber products, grazing, and minerals, all of which support jobs and economic activity. The direct and indirect economic impact from the national forest and grasslands in Wyoming is substantial. Local communities have a key role in sustaining our national forests and grasslands. We know this to be true. The strong bond and connection the land people in Wyoming have helps us focus our efforts improving forest and grassland conditions. We recognize that invasive and noxious species pose a significant threat to lands and resources in Wyoming. These invasive species claim vital resources from native plants, restrict their ability to grow and thrive, often causing mortality. Invasive species are recognized as one of the leading threats to biodiversity and impose enormous costs to agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and our economy. This topic is a priority for the Forest Service, as we know it is for Governor Gordon and the state legislature as well. To prevent the spread of invasive species, it's imperative that we have the necessary tools to begin treatments quickly and work with partners across administrative boundaries. On August 16, 2018, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, and Forest Service Chief Vicki Christensen announced new strategies for managing catastrophic wildfires by resolving invasive species, drought, insect, and disease epidemics. A new report titled Toward Shared Stewardship Across Landscapes, an Outcome-Based Investment Strategy, outlines the Forest Service's plans to work with the states to identify landscape scale priorities for forest treatments in direct coordination with the states, using advanced science tools. This allows the Forest Service to increase the scope and scale of critical forest treatments, protect communities, create resilient forests and grasslands. Across the state, we have put additional tools to work to help us be flexible and efficient as we share stewardship of the land. We have established master good neighbor authority agreements with the Wyoming Department of Agriculture, the Game and Fish Department, and with state forestry. Each of these master agreements will be used to address joint priorities while enhancing forest resilience, abating fire risk, improving wildlife habitat, and overall range conditions. In addition to these good neighbor agreements, the Forest Service has provided funding to the Wyoming Department of Agriculture and county and weed and pest districts across the state for noxious weed control and restoration projects. For example, the Thunder Basin National Grassland provided $180,000 in fiscal year 2018 for grassland restoration projects and noxious weed control through a combination of contracts and agreements with county conservation districts and weed and pest districts. The Bighorn National Forest provided $175,000 for treatment of noxious weeds and education efforts for county conservation districts and weed and pest districts in Sheridan, Johnson, Bighorn, and Washington counties in 2018 and in 2019. There is more work to be done, however. We recognize the need to treat larger areas in difficult terrain through aerial application of herbicide. As a treatment tool, this increases our effectiveness and efficiency by expanding our coverage and reducing the cost of treatments per acre. Aerial spraying rather than hand or vehicle-based spraying is our best option for controlling cheatgrass and other invasive grasses on large acreages and steep slopes. We share concerns about the invasive grasses Medusahead and Ventenata, both fast spreading and potentially devastating. These varieties can outcompete even cheatgrass and leave rangelands unproductive for wildlife and for livestock. We have been working as part of the Northeast Wyoming Invasive Grasses Working Group, which has a really difficult acronym. I'm not even gonna try to pronounce it. And in cooperation with our county and state partners in that regard. The Bighorn sponsored Sheridan County Weed and Pest District's successful application for funding from the Forest Service's state and private forestry program. A total of $100,000 was recently awarded to be used to inventory and treat these grasses, Medusahead and Ventenata. All of the national forests and grasslands in Wyoming can currently treat noxious weeds. In 2015, the Medicine Bow Route National Forest and Thunder Basin National Grassland completed an EIS that targets invasive weeds. The EIS included analysis of potential treatments and sites where aerial spraying with herbicides would be most effective. In 2016, they put that decision to work, treating approximately 3,200 acres in partnership with the Game and Fish Department's Sheep Mountain Mule Deer Initiative. Proved particularly effective in controlling non-native annual cheatgrass in the burn area of the 2012 Squirrel Creek fire. Additional funding and assistance for the project was provided by the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Muley Fanatics Foundation, the Mule Deer Foundation, the Wyoming Governor's Big Game License Coalition, Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust, Albany County Weed and Pest, and Albany County Secure Rural Schools with funding. The purpose was to control non-native annual cheatgrass on critical big game winter ranges to improve wildlife and livestock forage, enhance native vegetation species, reduce erosion, and minimize wildfire risk. In addition, this NEPA decision has allowed the forest to promptly respond to changed conditions. For example, treatments within the 2018 Badger Creek fire began within 2 months of fire containment. There is a need, however, to complete additional NEPA analysis on forests other than the medicine bow to use aerial application techniques. Here on the Bighorn, we've invested $100,000 this year to initiate that necessary analysis and augment our existing weed treatment capabilities to include the use of aerial application. The Bridger-Teton National Forest within the Intermountain region is currently completing NEPA analysis for control of noxious and other invasive plants through integration of manual, mechanical, biological, ground, and aerial-based control methods. The forest there expects a decision in the fall of 2019. This would allow for the application and treatment of invasive grasses within the same year. We recognize there is still more work to do, and we will continue to increase the pace and scale of forest and range management activities by working across jurisdictions and leveraging partnership resources. To meet these goals, we will continue working with a highly collaborative approach, coordinating closely with our neighbors and doing work they see as important to creating and maintaining resilient landscapes and supporting economic development in our rural communities. Chairman and committee members, that concludes my prepared remarks. I look forward to a continued and positive working relationship with you and with our counties, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Any questions, committee? Senator Blake.
Thank you. Thunder Basin grassland, the 180,000, was that restoration project due to the prairie dogs wiping out on the grass? And what is the status of the prairie dogs? And are we getting along with the private ranch owners?
Go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
All right, Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, that's an excellent question. So, as I understand it, the Thunder Basin's primary target for that $180,000 in those treatments was for addressing cheatgrass related issues. And I'm aware that they are working closely with the Department of Agriculture, the Wyoming Department of Agriculture, making progress on a grasslands plan amendment to address prairie dog issues as well as sage grouse and that other work. And I must say that I feel for my counterpart, Russ Bacon, there on the Medicine Bow Thunder Basin. That is a challenging issue, one that we don't face here on the Bighorn.
Mr. Johnson, I just have a few questions with in regards to that $100,000 that you've already granted to the local weed and pest. And can you just maybe describe the coordination that goes on between your office and local weed and pest, as well as any state agencies, how that looks, and maybe give an assessment of what's good, what could be done better, what maybe we can help with?
Sure, I'd be glad to, Mr. Chairman. So one of the things that I found when I came to the Bighorn about a year and a half ago was really good, strong working relationships, not just with our 4 counties, but with a lot of different organizations, including the weed and pest districts. We use what are called challenge cost share agreements to provide funding to those districts so they can do what they do best. They have the skills and expertise to identify and treat noxious weeds and do it promptly, more so than we do. They have a quicker ability to issue contracts for that sort of treatments more quickly than we do with our rules and systems. And so the primary method that we work together is through planning treatments together, inviting them into our planning processes, as well as state agencies. We've been partnering really closely with Wyoming State Forestry as we plan work on the landscape. And then also through providing the weed and pest districts funds to treat the work. This opportunity that came up is in addition to the funding that the forest, specifically we locally provide to the weed and pest districts for treatment. The state and private forestry program of the Forest Service had a competitive grant project program to target new and invasive species. So we supported Sheridan County's application for those funds. And we're really pleased that they were successful. So that really can help ramp up efforts to treat Medusahead and Ventenata as it shows up on the landscape. We can do a variety of things. I mean, we'd love to see additional treatment of acres as those grasses pop up using aerial application if necessary. But we're also supporting much smaller scale initiatives. Like for example, this past Saturday in Johnson County, In Buffalo, we partnered with a weed pole that has actually a bounty on weeds for the course of the summer. We're trying to get local kids convinced that if they pull weeds, they can earn money. We'll see how that pans out.
Like the idea of bounty. So with the additional capabilities that might become this fall, for you to do some aerial spraying, how do you see that working, interacting with federal and state and private lands? Are you going to be required to stay exclusively on federal land when you do that aerial spraying, or would there be an opportunity even if the state government or local weed and pest districts, but paying the Forest Service, you just do all those areas and types of lands at one fell swoop?
That's a great question. So one of the things I mentioned earlier is our Master Good Neighbor Authority agreements. The Good Neighbor Authority, which was expanded this year in, I believe it was either in the Farm Bill or the Omnibus Bill. There's a lot in both of those, and I get hard to keep track of which was which. But the Good Neighbor Authority allows us to sign agreements with state government organizations, state agencies, as well now as counties and tribal governments. So we intend to use our Good Neighbor Authority agreement with the Wyoming Department of Agriculture to more efficiently move through the planning process. But we will also use those agreements to work through the implementation phase so that we can, each organization can pool resources into maybe a single contract that would be able to be used to treat weeds across boundaries, across administrative boundaries, use the money in the most efficient way possible. And we have started down that road and are working pretty closely with state forestry, using that for fuels reduction projects. The first of which here on the Bighorn was the Buffalo Municipal Watershed Project, which Wyoming State Forestry was involved in the planning from right from the beginning, and we're now implementing. We'll continue to use Good Neighbor Authority in the Sheridan Municipal Watershed, and we definitely will make use of it for weed treatment.
Further questions coming for the Forest Service? Representative Blake.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Please continue.
Another invasive species, pine beetles. Where are they in their cycle? To me, the bighorns look like they weren't affected as much as the Medbo, Bridger Teton, but maybe you could give us a brief update on where we are with the pine beetles.
Of course, Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, be happy to. We feel very fortunate here that yes, we are still pretty green. We had some beetle activity on the bighorns, but nowhere near to the extent of our neighboring national forests in Wyoming. The bark beetle epidemic has definitely waned. I think that the course of this epidemic has probably run its course in Wyoming. However, when we look at the landscape here on the bighorn, it's, while we didn't get hit by beetles this time, we consider it more of a question of when, not if. And so we carry through our planning effort to ensure that the forest is as resilient as it can be to whether it's an insect and disease outbreak like beetles, spruce budworm, or large wildfire. Now, in response to what has already occurred, both the Shoshone National Forest and Medicine Bow have both recently completed large landscape scale assessments that will allow them to salvage log a lot of those stands that were negatively impacted by beetles, try to restore those forest conditions, yet improve wildlife habitat, and address the issues that they were left with as a result of the kind of large amount of beetle kill. The lava project on the Medicine Bow, I believe, was recently completed, and that's a couple 100,000 acres of treatment that should really help restore portions of the Medicine Bow forest and get it set on a trajectory back to a more healthy condition while reducing the fire risk that is residual on the landscape from all that beetle kill.
Okay, Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, do you guys have a program like after catastrophic wildfires to go in and do some extra invasive species control?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, we do. There's two steps really to post-wildfire mitigations. The first is burned area emergency recovery work, and that is to directly restore and address any immediate post-fire risks to both public safety and infrastructure. So could include, seeding and water bar work, et cetera, to protect road infrastructure and prevent weed spread. We also actively incorporate into our incident command and management system, weed treatment and washing for vehicles. So we have a lot of fire vehicles that come from all across the country to address a wildfire while it's going on. And who knows what they may bring with them, and seeds stuck up under the bumpers and stuff like that. So when we set up incident command bases, we include weed spraying as a mandatory part of that. So all those trucks come and go and get clean. Firefighters like it because they get a clean fire engine out of it. But we also, after that emergency repair work, we can pretty quickly go in and assess relative risk for infestation of weeds. That's a particular concern with cheatgrass. So, when I was speaking earlier about aerial application, while we have that tool on the Medicine Bow route and Thunder Basin grasslands, we don't have that tool in the rest of the national forests yet. Bridger Teton is the closest to getting that tool for aerial application, and will be not long after them. That will allow us to do what the Medicine Bow has done and really quickly post-fire go in and assess the relative risk of invasive species and start treatment to attack that seed source that's in the ground. We can do that through seeding or through spraying, a variety of methods, just to outcompete those weeds as we can. For example, the Medicine Bow got into that Badger Creek area within 2 months of the end of that fire.
Okay, any further questions? Before, so can I just realize that we're kind of a little bit further down the agenda than I anticipated, so we're on the aerial spraying for invasive species, but also, the state of federal efforts to combat invasive species, so we're both here, so doing well on time. So I need more questions overall for the Forest Service. Okay, Representative Blake.
Oh, my gosh, so are we actively going to start logging? I don't know what the logging situation is up on the Bighorn, but to me, that is part of the solution on pine beetles, in my opinion, as a railroader, I guess. But are there more leases going on in the Bighorn now? And maybe just a brief overview of leases around the state, if you can. Thank you.
Of course, yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative Blake. Across the Rocky Mountain region, which would include all of most of Wyoming, Colorado, South Dakota, etc., the Rocky Mountain region has dramatically increased its timber output over the last few years. This year to approximately 640,000 CCF. Both the Wyoming portion of the Black Hills has a significant timber output. The Medicine Bow has really significantly increased its output. We don't know specific numbers for the Medicine Bow. Here on the Bighorn, historically the forest was selling on an average of 10 to 13,000 CCF a year. We've increased that this year. Our target is 22,000 CCF, and we're on pace to do that. And that is for us here, that is work to ensure that the municipal watersheds of our communities are resilient and can withstand wildfire or better protected from wildfire. We're making use of new tools across the state to try to increase the commercial viability of our timber sales. We know that in beetle kill trees, their value declines fairly quickly. So we want to be able to get after those and get those stands harvested as quickly as possible, which the Shoshone and the Medicine Bow have been pretty successful in recent years. And then here, where we are a long distance from markets, from the timber industry, the nearest mills are quite a haul distance. And so we take a really a good hard look at whatever work, forest health work we want to do, timber harvest work we want to do out there on the ground, and ensure that we design those sales to meet our natural resource objectives, whether that's fuel reduction or wildlife habitat improvements or other objectives, and still have them commercially viable so they can still sell. I don't want to spend a lot of effort and money to put a sale up that doesn't get any bids. So we're trying to put that in our rearview mirror and put up sales that are much more commercially viable while still meeting our needs. I think we're being pretty successful. And then the Good Neighbor Authority with the state has helped us do that and will help us do that more frequently across the state.
Any further questions for the Forest Service at this time? Okay, thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you.
Okay, so looks like next up we have Jason Schraub, also here to talk about these state and federal efforts to combat invasive species.
Mr. Chairman. Is this on? No. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Josh Shore. I'm the supervisor for our County Weed and Pest Control District over in Powell. I'm also representing the Wyoming Weed and Pest Council. I just kind of want to take a little bit of time today and kind of discuss what the weed and pest districts, the partnerships that we have within the state with state, federal, local agencies, and some of the things that we try to do. And I'm going to leave time for some questions from you guys.
Our number one priority when we deal with not just weed and pest control and invasive species within the county is the private landowners. That's who provides us with our taxes, and that's who we help first and foremost. We also have a lot of real strong relationships with federal agencies such as the BLM, the Forest Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BAFIS, and the NRCS. We also do a lot of work and partner with the Wyoming State Lands Division, Wyoming Department of Transportation, the Game and Fish, and University of Wyoming, and the UW Extension Centers around the state. We also participate in a lot of different grant programs. Weed and pest districts have received a lot of money and done a lot of projects with the WWNRT, the Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund, along with the different local sage-grouse working groups across the state. We've also do a lot of work or have received grants from the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the Pulling Together Initiative, which is a federal grant program, North American Wild Sheep Foundation, the Wyoming state allocations that we discussed earlier, and grants from the pesticide registration fees. We also work a lot with the irrigation districts across the county, as well as the counties, and dealing with the county roads that we do. Kind of in short a little bit, Wyoming Weed and Pest Districts, we're kind of organizers. And when we're discussing noxious weed and pest issues and invasive species management, we kind of try to take the big picture and dealing with this different state and federal agencies along with the private landowners and make one cohesive management program across the whole county and across political boundaries and divisions, as well as watersheds and landscape level kind of things. That's what weed and pest districts, that's what we thrive on, and that's what we're really good at doing. We're organizers. And kind of piggybacking a little bit off of what the Forest Service said, some of the things that why we're so successful with the federal agencies is with the cooperative agreements and the good neighbor authorities that those guys have established. We have really good relationships with those folks. And without the federal agencies, we wouldn't be able to have those types of programs that we are. I know in Wyoming, sometimes federal agencies, they get a lot of rocks thrown at them, but when it comes to noxious weeds and invasive species, they do deserve a pat on the back. So, pat on the back. And going off of what he discussed with the aerial contracts, in Park County, I deal with the Shoshone National Forest, and aerial contracts and the NEPA process, aerial spraying on Forest Service lands across the state is the Wyoming Weed and Pest Council's #1 priority. I know on the Shoshone Forest, we don't have that ability yet. I know they're working on that, and it would really expand our abilities to fight different noxious weeds such as Dalmatian toadflax and cheatgrass on that forest. If we had that ability, it would really open up a lot of opportunities and make us a lot more cost effective to treat those things. I kind of want to go over, just highlight 3 different types of projects that have occurred over the decades across Wyoming that kind of demonstrate the weed and pest district's involvement in large projects. I think one was included in your packet up there, the Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee. In 2013, it's 6 years old. Park County Weed and Pest, we organized that. I included that just because that's the last time that we hosted it. At that time, there was 16 different agencies from 3 different states, including the Yellowstone, and 70 people. We spent over the course of 3 days
I can't even remember how many miles that we treated, but we treated a lot of different invasive species up there. And we found 3 that we did not know about. We found orange hawkweed and absinthe wormwood and common tansy up there that we did not know that we had in Northwest Park County, which leads up to Cook City in the northeast entrance of Yellowstone. In Yellowstone, as you all know, we have over 4 million or 5 million different visitors up there every single year. And a lot of those vehicles, they come from out of state. And in those areas, we get a lot of invasive species that are introduced in there from people, from their pants, from mud on their boots, from the tread in their tires. A handful of years ago, we found Dyer's woad between Cody and the East Park and the east entrance to Yellowstone Park. In a lot of the other western states like Idaho and Utah, that plant, Dyer's woad, consumes hundreds of thousands of acres, maybe millions of acres. I'm not exactly sure how much it infests in western states, and we found a small patch of it. I know in Teton County, they found some rush skeleton weed that is a horrendous problem in a lot of western states, and they caught it early. Also yellow star thistle, they found a small infestation and they got on that early. There's another, there's an issue going on in an eastern county that's just kind of come up in the last couple of years. It has to do with a plant called Deptford pink. It was in Niobrara County, and a few years ago, the supervisor there, they found a few plants south of, I believe it was Manville. And it wasn't a problem. They figured it had been there for a while. And then they noticed some in another area of the county. And then they had 200 acres of it over in this part of the county. Then they found 100 acres of it over in that part of the county. So that weed and pest district, they've kind of taken it upon themselves, and they're leading the charge on they're providing cost share for that to help the private landowners treat it, dealing with the federal agencies, the railroads, all that kind of stuff to get on top of that problem. So it doesn't expand any further. So that plant does not become the next leafy spurge or the next Canada thistle or one of those types of issues. That's what weed and pest districts really excel at doing. Another one I like to highlight is the Goshen County CRM. Let's see, I have it written down right here. There's 6 different high-risk areas in the state, in the county. And they focus a lot on Russian olive, salt cedar, Canada thistle, and Dalmatian toadflax. And several years ago, they won a national award that was awarded out in Washington, D.C. for their work on that coordinated resource management area that was led by Goshen County Weed and Pest. It's an outstanding program. The one that we're going to go visit later on today with the Ventenata and the Medusahead, Sheridan County they've done a lot of the heavy lifting in that and coordinating that project with the different funding sources and different agencies, different private landowners. And the Ventenata and the Medusahead problem that has hit Wyoming may be the most significant invasive species that has hit Wyoming in decades and decades and decades. It is a serious problem. So I really commend Sheridan County Weed and Pest and the work that they've done along with the other agencies, the Forest Service, University of Wyoming, and I can go on, but it's a serious problem. We've discussed the prairie dogs earlier on, and Weed and Pest does a whole lot of stuff with prairie dogs, as well as mosquitoes, and grasshoppers and Mormon crickets. And I know on the eastern side of the state this year, there's going to be some significant grasshopper problems, and they've already started dealing with those around the state. And they've kind of been delayed a little bit because of the cool weather, but now that it's going to warm up, the grasshoppers they're going to hit hard and fast. Weed and pest districts, we provide a lot of cost share dollars and a lot of expertise. We strongly believe in integrated pest management approaches. We do a lot of chemical treatment, a lot of biological control. Biological control of these noxious weeds, what it involves in 29 of the 30 noxious weeds in Wyoming, they come from overseas. And one of the reasons that they are so successful here is they are introduced without their natural enemies. So biocontrol is a process of going overseas and finding the different insects or pathogens or what have you that attack them and testing them. And it's a rigorous process that takes years and years. Make sure they're not going to attack other native species or crops or you know, some type of plant of economic concern, and then introducing them over here. There's been some very successful biological control programs all over the West and in Wyoming itself. Musk thistle, Canada thistle, Dalmatian toadflax, leafy spurge. The list is quite long. And Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, as well as the county weed and pest districts, are really involved in the research funding of that, as well as the implementation on the ground of those programs. Education is also a big priority of all the weed and pest districts, as well as the Weed and Pest Council. Noxious weeds and invasive species might not be the most exciting thing out there, but we try to make it a priority and educate people from little kids to adults. So I don't want to speak too long, so I am happy to take questions from the committee, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Ceremonies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, what's the science behind the application of a chemical to a particular noxious weed?
Mr. Chairman, the science behind it, in terms of the research that went in to work with the chemical or how it works on them, or?
Right. In other words, you have, pick any particular noxious weed and you apply a chemical to it. What's the science behind that so that you don't kill the good grasses around it?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, to take a chemical from when it's developed in the lab all the way out to the field, the EPA requires those companies to do a lot of tests on those to see what it's going to kill, what it's not going to kill, the different rates. They farm a lot of that out to different universities. And it's to do exactly that. At what rate? You know, are we going to use just a little bit of this or a whole lot of bit of this to kill a plant? And a lot of different species, it's how you control or kill a plant is dependent on the rate. And I know one of the things, especially in Wyoming, is that we don't want to kill grass. That's what we're trying to preserve here and try to grow. And the science behind that is, so that's why we do what we do, and we listen to the chemical manufacturers' label recommendations as well as the university recommendations as well. I don't know if that's clear.
So when the particular weed and pest districts order their chemicals for the year, they've identified the needs for the particular noxious weeds they're going to control, and then you go by the manufacturers when you put out a bid for them for those particular weeds?
Correct. Well, we identify, you know, what are the problems of the district, what types of plants, how much do we need, and then we place those orders for the year, and the different chemicals are based upon those individualized needs of that county for the species that are there.
So the science has been done when you get the chemical?
Oh, exactly right.
Yep.
Representative Larson.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm glad that Josh is here. He's a good friend and kind of impressed with the things Weed and Pest does in Park County. I think one of the questions I have, just you could discuss a little bit on your procedure on like the wilderness area, and that was kind of fascinating to hear. I think it's wilderness, maybe it's Forest Service where you actually go in with a pack animals and a crew. I think it's most of the summer.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes, and that is another program that we partner very closely with the Forest Service on. Dalmatian toadflax, Park County, we probably have the most Dalmatian toadflax of anyone in the state. Its main infestation area in Park County is on the South Fork of the Shoshone River, which is west Dakota. That plant is all over that valley, but it has escaped into backcountry areas. And Park County has a lot of wilderness areas. And so we have some specialized crew we contract them with, and they have special sprayers that are powered by CO2. There's no motors allowed in wilderness areas. And we work from the first week of May through sometimes the week or so before Thanksgiving. And we spend a lot of time in that country combing back and forth, looking for Dalmatian toadflax. There's some other species that we look for in some certain areas, but, and when we've run out of money for the Forest Service, we've used county monies or grant monies to fund that, because it's very important to keep those species contained to where it is right now. We don't want those loose in the backcountry into big infestations, because even if we had on the Shoshone permission to do aerial treatments, we can't do those in wilderness areas. We can't do those back there because of the machinery. So all that work it's horsepower work, literally.
Go ahead, Paul.
I have a couple follow-ups, if that's all
Okay,
right.
go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman, Mr. Chairman. Can you describe a little bit how the Park County works with the farmers in quarantine and what's worked over the years, I guess? I think it's something that we all ought to hear. I know as a ex-farmer and still have land, it's hard on the farmer to do it, but it's so important.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think the issue of the quarantine kind of came up earlier in Mr. Franklin's testimony. In the weed and pest statutes, there's provisions in there for a quarantine of either machinery or farm products. And Park County is one of 3 counties in the state that enact that or enforce it. And ours isn't so focused on equipment. It's based on the farm product. So on all the farms, some of the ranches that export, especially hay off of their places, and even small acreage landowners, we inspect those crops, make sure they're clear of noxious weeds, both in the field and on the edges. And it does put an onus on whoever's producing those products to control their noxious weeds. It might be the most successful weed control program that we enforce. Sometimes it doesn't make weed and pest the most popular organization in the county. It was enacted in its current form in 1980. And when I think it was in 78 or 79, Park County Weed and Pest didn't want to do it. And it was local farmers that brought that to the board and said, we want to do this because I'm controlling my weeds, but my neighbor to the west is doing nothing. And all his stuff is blowing onto my farm or coming through the water. And so the producers in Park County instituted it upon themselves, and it's to the weed and pest to go and do those inspections. And it's just try to make everybody freer of noxious weeds. There's still problems around. Obviously, there's still weeds, but it's to try to get everybody together, like we talked about earlier, to control weeds on a larger scale.
Go ahead.
One more.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This brings up, I think, my final question, and maybe a discussion with Josh and the whole committee, a bill I had brought with your recommendation a couple years ago. It didn't go very far, but I can't remember if we fought it at the Senate side or not, but it dealt with noxious weeds in landowners' property that they don't want to do anything with. And it's maybe a weed that's out of control, and that we're really, really scared it'll get out of control. And I think this was specifically up in the North Fork. And we were trying to make it, I can't remember, it was easier to get the process to move faster, I think was the whole idea. So if you could help explain what that was, that would be great, and hopefully the committee might listen to it, and maybe we could proceed further with it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I think that speaks to the enforcement powers that are available under the Weed and Pest Act. Right now, they're kind of difficult to enforce, and the bottom line is, if there's a landowner that has a weed problem, or let's say an invasive species that is new to the state, like Medusahead in a different part of the state, or yellow star thistle, or something like that, and they didn't want to participate in any type of control, the maximum fine that they could face per year is $2,500. And that has to be, it's a court process, and it has to be assessed by a judge and all that. The weed and pest Some people think that we can go write tickets. That's not true. We can't go write tickets or anything like that. And the issue that you're speaking of was West Dakota with leafy spurge. Park County is one county that is blessed not to have a lot of leafy spurge. So when somebody does have it or an area does have it, it gets us pretty excited. And we pay for the labor and 100% and the chemical. One gentleman decided he didn't want to, participate in the program, and we started the legal process, and he said, well, that's fine. And we finally came to an agreement by a gentleman's agreement. But by the time that happened, a lot of that his leafy spurge went to seed and went down the whole irrigation project. And there's a lot of seeds out there, and I don't know if they germinated or not, but they were out there. So the enforcement powers available to weed and pest districts is low.
Representative Larson McHugh, explain maybe what exactly that piece of legislation did.
I can't remember it that well, but I think the process was that we were trying to speed up the process of being able to get in there and actually do the spraying, if that's not correct. I thought, and I think everybody was concerned with private property rights, obviously. But when it was that erroneous or whatever, I mean, worrisome, that this was going to get in the North Fork, it's going to get to Buffalo Bill, and then it's going to spread to all our irrigation districts. But I think that's what the bill was pretty much about, was trying to speed the process up, I thought.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that is correct. Another instance that could really come up if Medusahead or Ventenata showed up in, say, a completely different county or different area than Northeast Wyoming, and a landowner said, I don't want to participate. I think it's just fine. And, if it was a large landowner, you could have a very serious landscape level problem on our hands with really no recourse.
Okay, Representative Larson.
One more time. Maybe I could bring that forward or back up to the committee in September if you would listen to it.
Maybe you could. I know. Okay, any further questions for
Okay.
Representative Henderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bring it up. So I was wondering if you could briefly help me understand how one district interacts with another among the group across the state, and how you assign priorities in terms of, I know you have a limited amount of resources, but how do you address priorities? For example, what would be your number one? It sounds like Medusahead, for example, might be your number one priority. But working among the districts, I'm saying, how do you do that? And how can the state help you in achieving, ticking off those priorities?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, one of the absolute beauties of the weed and pest law as it was constructed in 1973 was the ability to have a lot of local control and let those boards of 5 or 7 members really tailor the needs to what those producers need in that county. The program in Teton County is completely different than the one in Weston County. And so it's not a cookie cutter approach. And so we can, like, in some areas, Dalmatian toadflax is a big issue because that certain area has very little of it. In Park County, we have a lot. So, leafy spurge in our county is a big deal, where in some other counties, it's not a big deal. A lot of the weed and pest districts that border each other work really well together. And they kind of, it goes along that philosophy of partnering and kind of coordinating these large projects. And basically the priorities, as you stated, it's really up to those individual boards and the problems that are posed in that immediate area. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, you gave the example, Mr. Chairman. You gave the example of, trying to keep a problem from spreading into the backcountry.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you create a sense of urgency to address a problem? And how can the legislature help the local groups achieve success in addressing that problem. That's what I'm saying is what's your top 1, 2, or 3 needs at this point, looking forward over the next biennium?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, if I could a few of the needs is if we could get aerial spraying on a lot of federal lands. That's some assistance that we could seek from you guys. Either stable funding or increased funding for a lot of these real high priority types of problems such as Medusahead or Ventenata or cheatgrass. And keep on maintaining the relationships that we have with you guys, with your different agencies, with state lands, with Game and Fish, with YDOT, and having them work with us and allowing for the different needs of the state and not just a cookie cutter approach. The state says, this is how we're going to deal with this particular plant, but adapt to how they need to be managed in different areas of the state, depending on, the infestation levels or densities or something like that.
Any more questions? I guess I have one. So we're talking about it in coordination with the federal agencies, and really, I guess we can expand it to, other weed and pest districts, or even, folks in other states like Montana, wherever it may be. Is there anything that we could help with to help with that effort, especially as we look at it, especially in this neck of the woods, Forest Service being having more resources to bear? Is there anything that we could do to sort of really get bang for our buck, and whether it be state, federal resources?
Mr. Chairman, I think I touched on a little bit of it with what Representative Henderson's question was. And I think if we could get those, help with the aerial treatments of some things, not because the weed pest districts really like pesticides and we like to spray the whole world just for fun. But we're trying to really address landscape level problems. These are problems that are not going to solve themselves with a 4-wheeler sprayer or a horse pack sprayer. That's just not going to happen. And maybe making funds available for these large scale projects. And I know everybody's going to come to you guys and say, we need more money, we need more money, we need more money. But the fact of the matter is these programs are expensive. And to prevent, some of these plants like Medusahead and Ventenata, not to be a broken record, but they are worse than cheatgrass. And they do pose larger problems down the road than what we currently have now.
And so just to make sure I understand, is it possible now for a local weed and pest district to get funds through the grant program, which we discussed drafting a bill earlier this morning, increasing potentially some fees that would go to those grants? Do you have the capability now of leveraging those grants and then going in? Maybe have a joint contract with the Forest Service or wherever it may be to do some spraying, aerial spraying together. Do you have that current capability the way the statutes are set up?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And so if that bill that we drafted this morning does go through and become law, that would help out significantly, add an extra $1 million a year to go to those grants. That would help in this area as well. Yeah,
with those grants, Mr. Chairman, with those grants, we can spread those monies can be spent on different types of lands.
Okay, cool. Just so I'd make sure. Okay, any further questions, committee? Okay, well, thank you, sir. Appreciate your testimony, and very informative. So thank you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, do we have anybody else from the federal government? I think we got something from the BLM. Okay, there we go. All right, feel free to come on up. Is your mic on?
There we go.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. I'm Diana Hoffman with USDA APHIS Plant Protection and Quarantine. I'm not with AMS, so I'm not going to talk about hemp. So thank you for this opportunity to share information about APHIS PPQ and our programs to safeguard the country and specifically Wyoming from invasive species. In October, I had the opportunity to attend the Western Governors Association Invasive Species Roundtable, and we certainly share in the commitment to biosecurity, invasive species, and the collaborative efforts that we've heard about today too. Our mission in PPQ is to safeguard U.S. agriculture and natural resources against invasive pests and also to help facilitate the safe trade of exports. Through this mission, we approach it with a three-prong systems approach: offshore, borders, and across the nation. We work offshore to stay ahead of the invasive pests. Our international services, our pre-clearance and offshore program staff work with countries there to help ensure that the products they're going to ship to the U.S. are free of pests through various programs, systems approaches, et cetera. So we want to make sure that we have clean products coming to us. And then at the borders, our work at the borders, of course, is vital to ensure that the products that arrive here are clean, and also to prevent the entry of smuggled goods. We make sure that pest risks are mitigated that might come on, in, or with baggage, conveyances, or cargo. Customs and Border Protection enforces USDA regulations at the ports of entry. And we train the CBP agriculture inspectors and the dogs that they use to inspect cargo. In Casper International Airport here in Wyoming, there's a CBP officer, and PPQ works closely with that person. There's commercial flights that have arrived with trophies from Canada. There's charter flights that are also inspected, and the regulated garbage that might come on associated with the plane is safeguarded and treated under USDA safeguarding requirements. Nationally, at the ports of entry, the exclusion also includes the inspection of maritime vessels, looking for Asian gypsy moth, egg masses on the superstructure, other hitchhikers that might be associated with the conveyances themselves, as well as the cargo. The containers and cargo moving by rail, whether it arrive at our seaports and then onto the train system or at the borders, those are also inspected, including for hitchhikers, snails, weed seeds that might be associated with the containers or the cargo themselves. Up at International Falls, we have a treatment facility so that cargo that's arriving in British Columbia in the deep water ports, moving across Canada and then coming down into the central part of America is also inspected. And then there's treatment facilities right there. So if wood packing material pests, other types of pests associated with cargo or conveyances, weed seeds associated in or on can be taken off and cleaned also. And also around the port environs, PPQ conducts pest surveys. So we look to see if there's, depending upon the area, if it's southern border, we're looking to see if there's fruit flies. Of course, we're looking for Asian gypsy moth around the seaports, snails, weed infestations of invasive weeds that might come off the ships, and we take action on them too. We have 16 plant inspection stations. And our staff there look and inspect the live plants, plant parts, seeds, and we also use those services to identify any pests that Customs and Border Protection finds associated with cargo. We identify them. If they're considered actionable, we do the treatment associated with what the requirement is. We either treat, re-export, or destroy infested products. We also protect our U.S. animal health with our animal products and regulated garbage programs. Of course, devastating animal diseases like foot and mouth disease, African swine fever, those can enter the country by prohibited animal products or foreign garbage. On the domestic side, PPQ pre-departure programs in Hawaii and Puerto Rico inspect passenger baggage and cargo that's destined for the U.S. mainland. And then bridging for the ports of entry to across the nation, we have a smuggling interdiction and trade compliance program. They work at the ports of entry, and they also work in commerce at wholesale and retail facilities, and also looking at internet sales. Our internet team has been used as a model for other agencies and foreign governments because online purchases can be really risky, and sometimes without proper inspections or paperwork, it can really pose a pest risk. purchased in cyberspace and shipped in cargo space, plants, plant parts, live plants, fruits, vegetables, animal products, live insects for the collector community, snails for the collector community. Every possible thing you might think of is ordered online, of course, and some of those may pose threats for a range of invasive pests and diseases. The commerce site inspections are conducted here in Wyoming to ensure the distribution of legally entered materials, to seize prohibited items if found, and to provide education and outreach to enhance compliance. PPQ Wyoming conducts tracebacks and trace forward investigations, which has led to interdiction and seizure of prohibited items. In 2018, our SITC program, our Smuggling Interdiction Trade Compliance Program, seized prohibited items valued at over $2.6 million from retail stores, internet sales, express shipment courier inspections, trace forwards, and recalls of products that were found to be infested after they entered the country.
So just, was that 2.7 million in Wyoming alone, or is that
Oh,
nationwide?
no, this is nationally.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Oh, yes, I'd be quite
Okay.
Yes, nationally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our cooperative surveys and collaborative efforts are extremely important across the nation. The detection and control and rapid response require extensive multi-agency coordination to avoid large-scale agricultural economic losses and to keep our export markets open also. The human-assisted movement and the invasion biology and the climate and population dynamics that we've heard about today, they all factor into all of that, of course. We work very closely with our many partners at the federal, state, county, local level, universities, and non-governmental organizations. Last year, we conducted surveys with partners in all 50 states and 3 territories, targeting 386 high-risk and priority pests, and that resulted in the detection of 12 new or reintroduced species. I might add, too, that of the infestations or new invasive species that are found in the U.S., over 90% of those are from the public or from a scientist who's not an employee, but just was an avid collector and found something. So the education outreach that we've heard about also through our other people here today is, of course, really, really important, having those extra eyes and ears. We protected more than 600 million acres of rangeland and forage crops worth over $8.7 billion from damage caused by grasshoppers and Mormon crickets, again, nationally, although Wyoming's a really, really important part of this for sure. In Wyoming in 2019, we provided almost $130,000 to fund pest survey cooperative agreements, and those include for biological control of noxious weeds, surveys for pests of small grains, nematode surveys, and outreach activities. And additional programs, survey programs include caper beetle, honeybee, exotic wood borers, and bark beetle trapping, gypsy moth, grasshoppers, Mormon crickets, carnal bunt wheat survey, and potato cyst nematode. We partner with the weed and pest districts, the BIA, the BLM, and private landowners to survey and prepare for grasshopper suppression programs, and that's potentially in Fremont, Hot Springs, Natrona, and Johnson counties here this year. And we're working with other counties to provide survey and technical assistance. We're collaborating with National Park Service for gypsy moth delimitation and grasshopper surveys in Yellowstone National Park, and also with State Forestry, U.S. Forest Service, and the Department of Agriculture. Funding is available under the authority of the Plant Protection Act, Section 7721, which we used to call Farm Bill. And we really encourage Wyoming stakeholders to consider submitting project suggestions for funding. And through the Plant Pest and Disease Management and Disaster Prevention Program from the Section 7721, APHIS is providing $60 million to support 381 projects around the country that expand or enhance pest survey, identification, inspection, mitigation, risk analysis, public education, and outreach. And all U.S. producers benefit from these. And then finally, I'd like to talk briefly about a program that we have. It's a handout provided to you called the Federally Recognized State Management Phytosanitary Program, which I'll call Free Stamp from now on, rather than that big long name. So that's been established to help support states with their pests of concern that are detected at ports of entry. PPQ categorizes pests as quarantine significant or not significant, and we take no regulatory actions at ports of entry against non-quarantine pests. However, some non-quarantine pests are of concern to the states, and through this program, if a state or states want to keep action against that pest at a port of entry, there's a process to petition USDA so that if that pest is detected and it's destined to your state or those states that are petitioned against it, we will not release that shipment or require a treatment. So in summary, our work in three parts, overseas, on the border, and across the nation, are helping to contribute to safeguarding for the U.S. and for Wyoming. And these partnerships and collaborations are essential to accomplishing our mission. So I'd be happy to take any questions from you or comments. Thank you.
Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you help Wyoming Game and Fish to find zebra and quagga mussels? I guess that's the snails you were talking about.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman, Representative. PPQ does not work with the aquatic species. We work with the terrestrial snails.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Representative Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned that there's like, for example, the CBP officer at the Casper Airport, and is so if somebody, are those random inspections, or if, I mean, say if I go to Canada and kill a caribou or something and bring it back, are they notified that that's incoming, or how did that work?
Yeah, there's notifications on trophies coming in,
Gotcha.
yes. Because it depends, there's notification because it depends on what it is. Some must proceed to a licensed establishment for the taxidermy. Yeah.
Okay, any further questions? USDA? So I was just sorry, I'm hoping to go back to that, what was that last big acronym you used? The
Free stamp.
Free stamp, okay. All right, so can you just, so if I understand that correctly, I'm just looking at the PowerPoint now. So if, say, for example, we state of Wyoming sees a invasive species that we believe came from a particular port or somewhere else, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
By definition, we have the ability to petition through this program to say, hey, look, could you take a look at, these shipments coming from this particular area at this location, and could you maybe look at quarantining those? Is that how that, just maybe a little bit more information?
Yeah, the program is about imports. And if a state determines that there's a pest of consequence that you have legal authority to act upon, but that the USDA considers non-quarantine significant, and you petition us, we can stop it at the border from proceeding. So for example, Florida has petitioned for an allium leaf miner that we know actually occurs here in America, but they don't have it in Florida, so they don't want products that are being imported with it. And so we're able to, at the ports, if a shipment comes in with that pest found and it's destined for Florida, we will not allow it in unless it receives treatment if there is such.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Representative Hunt.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I asked this of Mr. Brian Mueller earlier, but so Wyoming being not a border state, how much interagency cooperation and networking goes on between the states and the feds and between each state? So, I mean, if we are reliant upon coastal states or the border states, say Montana, Idaho, whatever, to be the first line of defense, not including obviously direct inbound international flights, what are they doing more on those border states or on those coastal states than what an interior state like Wyoming would be doing? And what, other than say our ports of entry on the interstate, are we doing anything less than what they're doing, or is it as rigorous with interstate shipment as it would be at a border checkpoint, basically?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt. With interstate movement, unless there's a domestic quarantine, it is up to the states in terms of what you're allowing in between. So we have some domestic quarantines, such as our Phytophthora murmurum, also sudden oak death, in which there are nurseries that have to be inspected under a certificate program in order to ship their stock out. And Polly spoke a little bit about some of the nursery inspections also. From the Northeast, where European gypsy moth, or gypsy moth as we call it, is established, there's requirements for inspection of nursery stock, Christmas trees, even moving containers, moving vans that move from those areas to other parts of the United States, including Wyoming. So you're getting as much protection as everyone else is for the interstate movement. Yes.
Any more questions, committee? Okay, one last one, since we're talking about quarantines. We discussed a little bit earlier about how our quarantine program within the state of Wyoming is mostly revolving around agriculture. Obviously, your program is more robust. Can you give us a sense of, if you have one, what other states' quarantine programs are like? Are they limited only to agriculture, or can they quarantine anything that's a threat from an invasive species standpoint?
I would hazard a guess. I mean, I'm more familiar with the states that have agriculture quarantines, the CDFA, border inspections, that type of work. But I don't know. There might be some with veterinary quarantines also. I really don't know.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Any further questions? Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, is there a mechanism through your department if someone feels like they're quarantined unreasonably, is there a mechanism where they can appeal that, or how does that work?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, thank you. Can you help clarify the question in terms of they feel that they're quarantined regarding?
Mr. Chairman, basically any reason they'd be quarantined, and then is there a way they can appeal and say, no, we've taken care of this, or we think it's unreasonable or something like that? Or is it strictly regulatory action you can take and that's the way it is, and there's no way getting out until you take care of the pest problem?
Mr. Chairman, it depends. If it's very clear it's a quarantine pest, invasive species per USDA's standard, and we have regulations on it, then the action of a quarantine boundary, a treatment requirement, any other actions that need to be taken, compliance agreements, inspections, certifications, those need to be taken care of. Now, that is an ongoing dialogue with pest risk assessments and standards. What we do on the USDA part of it in terms of protecting our safe trade is we're obligated to meet international standards so that there's equivalency or harmonization from the countries that receive and ship to us also. So there's some standards we have to meet with that, and we definitely work with our state partners, our state plant regulatory official, the National Plant Board or the Regional Plant Board affiliates too. And there are a lot of conversations about some of our quarantines and, what the impacts are, what size it can be, making it as small as possible so that the states can promulgate a smaller quarantine area than a whole state, and then we can follow the state's quarantine. So it's definitely a partnership in it, but then there's also some international standards we have to meet.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Okay, thank you very much. I
Thank you.
appreciate your testimony. Looks like we also have the BLM here. So we can go through our federal agency alphabet soup. I think Mr. Phillips is up next.
Good afternoon. How much time do I have? Are we getting short?
Oh, we're doing okay. Maybe if 10 to 15 minutes would work for you. If that's acceptable, that'd probably work very well for us. So.
Okay. Mr. Chairman and members of the Joint Agriculture Committee, I appreciate the time and the invitation to come provide some information about BLM and invasive species as it's engaged in the state of Wyoming.
And for the record, you are Mike Phillips from the Moreland Field Office. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Just have to make sure we say it. So
I was going
thank
to
you,
get
sir.
to the point. Yes, I'm Mike Phillips. I'm the field manager for the Worland BLM office, which is over in the Bighorn Basin. It's part of the Wind River Bighorn Basin District. There's 3 districts in the state of Wyoming, 10 field offices. So I drew the long straw, or the short straw, however you want to put it. Since we've heard a lot about things today which are very in common, particularly like with the Forest Service, and then with Josh talking about with the weed and pest, I'm going to kind of shorten this up a little bit since you already have a copy of my talking points. So I'm just going to highlight some of the main points that are brought forward. And the first one is the BLM works on basically a 5-prong attack when dealing with invasive species. First, dealing with cooperative agreements with the weed and pest. And that's developing the base funding for the programs in each office. From there, we go to the field office personnel. We have a weed and pest coordinator that is also certified in every office that deals directly with the weed and pest. So we are able to work with the weed and pest. We also are able to treat invasives and noxious weeds ourselves jointly. We also have funding that we look at for projects, which are in addition to our base funding. So we'll have base funding with the weed and pest. Then we'll also have other projects that we identify. So with the base funding allows the weed and pest to go out and spray for invasive or noxious weeds as they find them. But we also have areas that are identified or watersheds that we look at projects to do those kind of things. The fourth part of that is we have cooperators or companies that want to do their own spraying. Or an example would be an oil and gas company spraying their pads, or a mining company. We do help support that and work with them individually as a whole for the BLM. And these things are happening across the state, not just in one office. It happens in all offices. And then the fifth part that we really tie back to is the ES&R, Emergency Stabilization and Rehabilitation activities after wildfires. Well, some of the big issues we've had, and I'll give an example, in the Bighorn Basin is all the cheatgrass fires that we've had. We go in after the fire and spray, and working with the weed and pest and others, and do a lot of aerial spraying for cheatgrass to take care of those kind of issues, so we can kind of lessen the severity for next year or the year after that. Now, a one-time treatment isn't going to solve the problem. We have to look at long-term settlements or long-term solutions. So it may be a 5-year or 10-year plan that we look at. So working with our cooperators across the state, not just the weed and pest, but the game and fish, the Forest Service, the NRCS, other agencies and individuals to put things together, and looking at an IPM approach on how we address noxious weeds. An IPM is integrated pest management. So it's not just always dealing with herbicide. It's also dealing with physical removal, and you heard some of that earlier today. It's also dealing with biological, from insects to other things. And I'm going to throw targeted grazing in on that, using livestock, either goats or sheep or even cattle, in specific situations to either reduce fuel hazards or to work on noxious weeds as we go forward. The fifth part of that would be education. You heard a lot about education today. That's one of our greatest tools for the public to understand what the problem is. As you drive through the streets of most towns, what is one of the trees that you'll see a lot is tamarisk, because it's pretty. But that is a fairly severely water-sucking invasive species that we're trying to deal with. Well, educating people about those kind of things. Also like delphiniums, which is larkspur. It's not good on the rangeland, but it looks pretty in your garden. So understanding those things. And the sixth part of that would be dealing with cultural issues. Dealing in, what I'm talking about is maybe not grazing in the same pasture year after year after year, or dealing with the issues that are taking place on how they take place. So I talked about earlier about collateral duty of BLM staff that deals directly with the weed and pest, and they're all certified. With working with these partnerships across the state, there's over 25 different CRMs or weed management areas. You heard about one today was the Goshen County CRM, very, very successful. There's others from Kirby Creek to Yellowtail to Grass Creek. And then you've started a new one up in this part of the world, this Northwest Invasive Grass, something. It's quite the thing. But that's how we leverage our dollars. We can all spend a certain amount, but if we pool our dollars and pool our expertise and get the university involved and the experts involved in what we're trying to do, it goes so much further. That's where we get into early detection and rapid response. Early detection, find it early. Treat it quickly before it becomes a major problem. That reduces the cost overall as we're looking at these kind of things. So we've talked a lot about cheatgrass here in the past, in the present, and in the future. It is a major issue that takes place that we're addressing. It's starting to get away from us a little bit. But we also have other issues that are taking place with Medusahead and Ventenata that's coming in that we need to attack now versus later. Because invasive species and noxious weeds, they don't know any boundaries. They don't stop at this is federal land or this is private land or state land or BOR. That's why we have to all work together to make this work. So when we start looking at this deal with Ventenata and Medusahead, that group has spent over $460,000 in the last year doing inventory and some treatment. Now, some of the treatment, most of the treatment's all been on private lands, but BLM has helped support some of that. And we use that through the Wyden Amendment because then we can show that it shows benefit back to the public lands. That's where taking these groups together outside of looking at just looking at a geographical region or a watershed to address these kind of problems. I know that was pretty quick and fast. Do you have any questions?
Any commission or questions for the BLM committee? Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, does the BLM have a protocol for bark beetles like the Forest Service?
Go ahead, Mr. Phillips.
Mr. Chairman, I can't read your name, but yes, we do. We do have a process. We have a forester that's involved. Most of our forested lands, we have very little in Wyoming. Where I work in a desert, but we do have some on the fringes, and we work with the Forest Service a lot. As they mentioned, part of the issue with bark beetles is having a ability to harvest and someone willing to take that forest product. A lot of the mills have went bankrupt, and there's starting to be a few that are starting to open up, but the travel cost is pretty extensive.
Any more questions, committee? You mentioned something that seems pretty interesting to me, and I probably should have asked other folks as they're coming up, but you talked about early detection. And it seems like we talked about anecdotally, you have to kind of wait for somebody to drive by or hike by to notice some of these invasive species taking root. Are there any other methods for that early detection?
Well, on the short answer is yes, there is. The issue that we have is we all have a lot of staff that's out in the field that can identify plants. If it's from a range con to a wildlife biologist to even a PET, they're out there looking. We also get lots of calls from individuals or private citizens. What is this? By being able to identify that, and if we don't, we can take it to the weed and pest and they can help us identify it. Or we can take it to the university and kind of key out what we're trying to find so we can identify those areas, have them on a map, treat them early if it happens to be an invasive or a noxious weed, and take care of those up front.
Well, go ahead, Forest Service, yeah. So.
The Forest Service also is exploring opportunities to use drones to detect invasive species. In fact, just recently, the Bighorn submitted a request for flight time with the fleet of large drones with high-resolution multispectral cameras and infrared military-grade technology. The Forest Service has a national contract for those aircraft for wildfire use. However, when they are not active on a wildfire, the aircraft are available to us, and we want to test and see if the high-resolution imagery they can generate for us will help us identify populations of different invasive species on the ground. We'll see how it works.
Okay, great. Awesome. Okay. Any further questions? Any? All right, well, thank you, sir. You got off easy, so.
Well, you have my number.
All right, fair enough. I
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay, so at this point, ladies and gentlemen, in the agenda, it seems like we've covered 3 of the 4 sub-bullets within this overall topic from the government agency perspective, talking about the state and federal, even local efforts for invasives. We talked about foreign shipping. We talked about aerial spraying and other applications of aerial assets to help invasives. So at this point, we're just going to go ahead and see if there's any public comment. Anybody else wants to get up and talk on any of those 3 issues? Somebody in the back, come on up, sir.
Good afternoon, Rod Litzel with the Johnson County Weed and Pest. I would just like to, I guess, Mr. Chairman, would like to reiterate the importance of the partnerships with our federal agencies. Not only are they great to work with, but I think they're important or critical for the success of some of the projects that we carry on private lands. If we didn't have those partnerships with the neighboring Forest Service, BLM, and state lands, if we didn't have that, it would be definitely an uphill battle for us on private land. With respect, though, to the aerial treatments, those of us on the Bighorn County, Johnson, Sheridan, Washakie County, we all recognize the need to be able to have that aerial application as a tool. Not necessarily to be just indiscriminately spraying up there, but there's cases where we need to be able to do that. There is a fit for that. In the case of Ventenata, perhaps Medusahead, that time is of the essence. If we find a new patch of that, we've got to be able to react in a responsible manner. Johnson County in particular, we had 3 known locations of Ventenata, one of which was on the forest. We were fortunate in the fact that it was an area that was accessible by ground rigs. If that weren't the case, I'm not sure how we would have gotten it treated. But the fear in the back of my mind is, we think of ourselves as being part of the solution, but as we're using ground equipment to go through a patch like that to treat it, are we then becoming part of the problem? We make every effort we can to try and clean our equipment, especially in that scenario, before we move to the next location. But you never know if you're not going to get it all. And so having the ability to aerially treat in a situation like that, especially with something like Ventenata, is critical. And then the last thing, I guess, Mr. Chairman, you posed the question, is there anything that you guys can do? I think the fact like the tour this afternoon is critical for you guys becoming aware of what some of the local issues are. I've had, Luke and I both had Senator Kinski on tours, being able to go to your local districts and maybe going with the weed and pest guy or BLM, Forest Service, and seeing what those issues locally are, really helps us out in the long run too, to be able to communicate with those, maybe not necessarily in a formal setting, but more informal setting, and we can communicate those issues. And again, thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, any questions, committee?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Any more public comment? The last agenda item. Oh, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Hale Redding with Weston County Weed and Pest District Supervisor. Just kind of want to hit on some of these topics as well. As far as aerial spraying on Forest Service, I'm one of the fortunate ones that gets to do that. We have Medbo. Time and efficiency and economics of it is greatly increased. We went from treating about 40 to 50 acres of leafy spurge year on Forest Service ground to 150 to 200 acres on the same amount of money. It's a matter of a few hours versus a month. So with ground rigs. The cooperative agreements that we have with Forest Service and BLM, state lands, when we were doing the pine beetle, we probably had one of the more broader sweeping agreements with the Forest Service. Luckily, it didn't cost them a dime. It was all thanks to you guys. So, and with the BLM as well, BLM did kick in money, Forest Service, so didn't prosecute us for poaching trees. So, but it gave us access to do them truly landscape projects is what we did in northeast corner there. Our agreement with the Forest Service was I can't remember what it was really called, but it was about 80 pages. You know, and it detailed what we could do, how much money we would spend on their ground, their in-kind matches, everything. Our BLM agreement was 6 sentences in my weed agreement. But both agencies were great to work with. I mean, they knew the importance of what we were dealing with up there. And Mr. Chairman, the one question you guys have kept asking everybody that's testified today is, what can you do? You know, the support of the aerial treatment is important, but consistent funding for these big projects is paramount. You know, when we were doing the pine beetle project, the consistent funding from the state legislature is what helped us succeed up there in the Black Hills. You know, and it helped us leverage our time, our federal dollars. I know the BLM and the Forest Service, neither one would have really stepped up to the plate and been agreeable to the project if we didn't have the money to do the treatments. You know, so we were able to, with the grant program you guys, or through the state legislature and the Department of Ag, then WWNRT, you know, we were able to use that money to help leverage money out of the BLM and help with the cooperation of the Forest Service out of the Black Hills. So thank you for your time.
Hey, any questions, committee? Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. So looking at what's going on in budgeting in other areas, would it help from your perspective if we looked at more than just one biennium? So I'm thinking about, like, say, 2 bienniums or 3 bienniums, current, base, and out year kind of thing. In terms of setting up contracts, we're talking about aerial activities. Would that facilitate some of your resource constraints?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, from my perspective, yes, it would help with my future planning on projects. You know, I can't speak for every district and agency that we work with, but from my point of view, it does help, you know, to know that in the future there could be some consistent funding. I know on the point of with the pine beetle, Senator Driscoll and I discussed it, and you know, when it came back to where you guys created a line item in State Forestry's budget for that, and it was so there was consistent funding, and he wasn't coming back to you guys every year asking for more money. So,
Representative Taft.
Mr. Chairman, looking at these aerial photos of your Ventenata, do you have a chemical that is just specific, works on this weed and not other grasses?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I'm going to defer that to Mr. Mealer. I don't deal with Ventenata, luckily, right now.
Because you're talking about spraying, you know, aerial spraying, and these pictures cover an awful lot of country.
Yeah, there is herbicide that is specific to grass, different species of grass as well, but you know, and a lot of it accounts to timing, but, like I said, I will defer that more to Mr. Mueller here after a bit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Simpson.
I have a financial question for you. What percentage of your budget comes from your 1% or 1 mil levy property taxes?
About an eighth of ours. Our 1 mil is about $140,000 and we have a $800,000 budget. Weston County, we do collect 2 full mill levies, for leafy sturgeon special management program, our second mill.
Okay. Any further questions, committee? Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Any further public comment on invasive species? Next thing that we're going to be looking at is more of a, I guess, informative discussion. So we're going to wrap up any potential policy action we might take here. So if you have something to say about invasive species, as a member of the public, now is the time to do it. Okay, all right. Well, next up we have UW back up here. So welcome back. Yeah, you get to testify at morning and afternoon. Lucky you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I would like to open by saying that I'm honored to be a part of the slate today. I feel like I have been impressed with the dedication and commitment of the professionals in our state that are focusing on safeguarding our natural resources against invasive species, and I hope that you have felt that as well. There have been a number of themes that I think have been sort of evident in the testimonies today, things like due diligence across a landscape scale and long-term commitment and cooperation across different jurisdictions. And I think that I'm going to start to drill down on those a little bit more within a specific context of what we're doing here in Northeast Wyoming. I guess the other theme that I forgot to mention is that we need to hire a marketing person for our working group because apparently our acronym is terrible and no one can remember what it is.
It can't be a good government agency without a good acronym, right?
And so I provided you guys with mostly some visuals as part of your packet, and I was hoping to walk through some of those here. I'm going to touch on some of these themes a little bit more, specifically focusing on invasive annual grasses because that's one of the primary issues we're looking at in this corner of the state. But know that many of the principles that I will try to discuss, and I will try to be brief, also apply to other invasive species that are not only grasses. Representative Tass's question about a herbicide that specifically attacks invasive annual grasses within essentially a non-target with a bunch of grasses that we want to keep around. I'll touch on that a little bit. And the short answer is that it depends on the chemistry, it depends on the timing, and it depends on the species as well. And we'll see that for those of you that are able to join us on the tour this afternoon. So because of that, invasive annual grasses give us a unique challenge that some of the other weedy species that we have do not, because of that taxonomic overlap between the target weedy species and those things we're trying to keep. So these are the 4 primary invasive annual grass species that we have in Wyoming. There's a few other incidentals. The 2 most common are cheatgrass or downy brome and field brome or Japanese brome, which are in the left and right diagonals. We've been dealing with these guys for a long time. And I would argue that downy brome or cheatgrass is most likely the most impactful invasive species in the western United States, largely because of its ecological footprint is incredibly diverse and because of its ability to change the nature of the way that systems work by shifting what may have historically been a wildfire interval of somewhere north of 100 years between wildfires to parts of the western U.S. that now burn every 3 to 5 years, specifically because of the fuels that are generated and the early maturation and drying up of cheatgrass. So for those of you that are concerned about conservation and wildlife species that depend on sagebrush, big sagebrush species, cannot resprout following a wildfire very well. And so they have to reestablish from seed. And when you have these repetitive fires, it essentially prevents sagebrush from reestablishing on those sites where the wildfire interval has changed. A potentially beneficial thing about cheatgrass and Japanese brome is they do provide decent forage early in the year. However, it's highly variable from year to year. And so if you're making your grazing management decisions based on what might be 100 pounds per acre one year and 1,500 pounds per acre the next year, it's difficult to plan your grazing activities when you're dependent on a highly variable forage source. That's about the end of the beneficial aspects of something like cheatgrass. We take the two new ones that showed up. So we've got Ventenata here and Medusahead in the upper left. You will see both of these today on the tour if you're able to join. Take all the redeeming qualities of cheatgrass that we just mentioned. Take those away and make palatability less, forage quality less, and yet maintain all the negative impacts, such as changing the wildfire frequency and outcompeting native vegetation. And you have Medusahead and Ventenata. A number of previous speakers talked about it's like cheatgrass except worse, and that's what we're dealing with here. We'll talk about that a little bit more. A little bit of a delay here. There we go. I wanted to back up just a moment and just talk through this relationship, as this is established and supported in the literature from a number of studies throughout a number of different systems, is that as we increase from basically no invasive species on a site, and we increase in abundance until that particular invasive species becomes the dominant vegetation type on a particular location, we see a concomitant decrease in what we might call ecosystem goods or services. These might be things like species diversity, forage quality, forage quantity, wildfire stability. And across the board, there's almost always a decrease in those beneficial functional attributes of an ecosystem as we get more and more invasive species on a site. The other thing that happens is when you get way out there into a highly invaded state, that site also becomes more susceptible to invasion by other invasive species. And so not only are we losing the desirable species that we want to have on that site, but we're increasing our risk for additional and sometimes even worse invasive species for entering that site. This is why we manage weeds. We've been talking a lot about killing weeds and managing invasive species and things like that. It's not just because we have this incredible hatred for a specific species. It's because of what we potentially lose if we stand idly by and allow those species to come to dominate those systems. And this is at the crux of all the different presentations that we heard earlier. And we also know that if we catch that invasion at an earlier stage, before those plants are able to start to change the nutrient cycling on a site, build up root reserves or seed banks, that our probability of successfully removing those species from a site is much higher than if we wait until it has become dominated by those species. That's the premise for this idea of early detection, rapid response that several of the other speakers have spoken about. Kind of stolen from the medical literature, if you will, and that if you can find an aggressive cancer early when it begins and take an aggressive response before it begins to really take over, then you have a higher probability of successfully treating and removing that from the system, whether it be a human system or in this case, a natural system. We talk about susceptibility to cheatgrass. We go back 20 years ago, and there was a kind of an overwhelming sentiment that Wyoming did not have to worry about cheatgrass because of our high, dry climate. Some work that a former graduate student of mine, Kara Noseworthy, did, gathering thousands of cheatgrass data points around the state and then modeling out habitat suitability, just to point out that the darker the color, the higher risk of cheatgrass occurring. And this is actually held out pretty clearly and truly on the ground. And there's a few other things that I wanted to point out following that. And I'll show you a little bit broader perspective. So this is from a satellite-based imagery data collection platform out of University of Montana and NRCS, where they're looking at basically plant cover by functional groups across the entire western U.S. The box is us, the state of Wyoming. And so we're primarily going to think inside the box, but we're also going to look outside the box a little bit more. To our west and north have historically been the highly problematic areas for annual invasive grasses, primarily the Great Basin and the northern part of the Great Basin. And for these set of maps, the darker the red color, the higher the level of primarily annual grasses on these rangeland systems. So if we look farther to the west in the Great Basin, we see in 2004, there's already a high amount of annual cover. If we look at 2004 versus 2017, you see that definite increases in annual plant cover in the Bighorn Basin, and then for much of eastern Wyoming. And this is very much agrees with what some of our Wyoming state data shows. So not only is it suitable habitat, but the infestation is also increasing.
Real quick, if I could ask a question about that, those images. We were talking about early detection, and it seems like we got a pretty good platform, you said, through NRCS or University of Montana to detect these invasive species using satellite. Is it granular enough to take a look at specific areas and do similar function as we were discussing earlier, either observing new invasive species on foot or maybe even through a drone or aircraft? Is there a possibility that there's a commercially available satellite option to perform it for a similar early detection function?
Mr. Chair, that's a very good question. These are pretty coarse scale data here, especially because they're looking across the entire western U.S., in some cases the entire U.S. There's a significant amount of research and active on the ground applied work that's occurring now, looking at using remote sensing, everything from drones to satellite imagery, to try to locate those smaller populations. The resolution and patch size oftentimes becomes a limitation. So if you're dealing with something like this, it's 30-meter resolution, and you're trying to find a patch that's as big as this table, you're going to lose it in the resolution of the imagery. But technology in that realm is moving very quickly, and there's a number of folks that are working on that. In fact, we're cooperating with a number of our federal partners and folks like NASA to try to pick some of those species out that are of high importance here as well. So improvements are ongoing. I don't think we're there yet to where we can find very small patches of very new infestations unless they're like really visually distinct. And so we're getting there, we're just not there yet. If that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Yeah, obviously. Go ahead.
I do have a question. If you go back that black and white slide. Yeah. Why would you have a streak of white right down through that concentrated area there?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, that's a good question. It's a riparian area. And so these data are based on habitat suitability. And so essentially modeling of ecological characteristics that increase the probability of cheatgrass establishing on a site. And in some of these riparian areas, we have such dense stands of perennial grass, then cheatgrass does not do well in high moisture soils relative to those other perennial grasses. And so it's more of a problem in our sort of higher, drier, coarser soils. And my guess is that just shows part of that travel in a riparian area. It's an ecological. Now, would I go out there and stand and jump up and down and say we are never going to have cheatgrass on these sites? No. But it's lower probability than some of the other soil types and ecological sites.
It's interesting that whole area is.
The high elevation stuff was cut out. So we cut out anything above, I believe, 10,000 feet for this model. And I will also say that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so the data that inform the model are only as good as the data that we could generate.
Sounds like a good scientific answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Oh, Senator Steinmetz.
We go back to the red and white slides. I'm just curious, how do you identify that as cheatgrass? How does the satellite identify that as cheatgrass?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, it's a good question. Without going into too much detail, just for the case of time, Spectral signature, so the actual signal that is coming from reflected light from those species. We're able to pick up on differences in that spectral signature. So think about reflected light, and that's how we see different colors, and also at different times of year. So we know that many of our annual grasses mature more quickly than our perennial grasses. And so as that spectral signature starts to move from green to purple to brown earlier, then that would be picked up in an analysis like this. As the other perennial grasses stay green longer, I can show you a picture that will demonstrate this point in a moment. But it's basically timing and spectral signature of those different species, and it's largely picking up patches that are large enough to be picked up from a satellite imagery.
Co-Chairman Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Brian, are these two composites from 04 and 17, are they roughly the same time of year?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt, they should be from the same time of year. We would have to contact the folks at University of Montana to get the absolute details on the algorithms they used for this. But ideally, it should be a moving window to pick up those grasses that would probably tie back to temperature and moisture to get that growth stage correctly.
I just asked because just looking at the map as a whole, and the expansion, there's clearly more forage in 2017 nationally, regionally, than there is in 04. Both on the west into, I'm guessing, let's see, Idaho and northern Nevada, and then over into Montana, North Dakota, and then even down south into that. So I was just curious if that's a different season, or if there's, I guess if there's, is there any indication that change is strictly invasive species related, or is that just everything combined altogether?
That's an excellent question. So they have the data sets also for total vegetation cover, bare ground, perennial grasses. So the spectral signature and timing for this specific map should be teasing out annual plant cover, not our perennials. You are correct, though, in that it most likely reflects differences in moisture patterns among those years as well. And you guys can, if you are interested, for those of you that would like to play around with this, the rangeland analysis platform is freely available, and you can actually draw a polygon on your specific ranch and look and see what has happened over the years from, I think, the late 90s all the way until currently.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay, thank you. Glad you guys were interested in that. I was not expecting that to generate. So this picture is a little bit difficult to see. This clearly illustrates that spectral signature difference. And I think this goes back to one of Senator Moniz's questions earlier about what does it take for a new herbicide to come to market? What kind of research occurs? One of the roles that we play as a land grant institution is cooperating with the chemical industry and with our partners such as Weed and Pest and other federal and state local agencies to evaluate emerging tools to see if they will be useful for the different situations that we have that are facing the state. This is actually a picture of a herbicide trial. We might get to see one of these today, where we were evaluating some new chemistry in conjunction with one of the industry partners to see what would work well on something like cheatgrass and what would not. And so they work with us. Sometimes they send us little numbered vials that we're not really sure what's in there, and we go out and we try it on different on different species and different situations to learn how they work. And that helps them develop their labels, and it makes sure that we have Wyoming specific data that is pertinent within those labels, so that all the labels are not just developed in Missouri or somewhere under different conditions that would not be suitable for us here. So in this picture, all the purpley brown stuff is cheatgrass that has not been treated. All the green stuff is primarily perennial native grasses that were released following a herbicide application the previous year and are persisting on that site. It's pretty impressive. We can look at a different picture. You can see here all the brown dead material is cheatgrass that grew that year. Over here, you will see that there's nothing in those interspaces. And this is a sort of a different view. It's a different site. We can we can do this relatively consistently. Partly it goes back to rate. Annual grasses have to emerge and establish from seed each year. They don't have a perennial root structure. And so we can apply at lower rates herbicides that are tied up in the soil. And as those new seeds begin to emerge and germinate and emerge, they're small enough that they're very susceptible to lower rates of these herbicides. And so we can differentially affect our annuals versus our perennials based on rates and timing. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go out on our tour. But this is not really enough. And the reason I say that is for annual species, sure, we're trying to kill those newly emerging seedlings, but for many of these species, there are seeds that stay in the soil and are viable for a number of years. And that number of years is typically longer than the residual effect of any specific herbicide application. And so if any of you guys have been involved in some of these annual grass, cheatgrass control projects in the past, you might know that if you go out and you do one treatment and then you walk away, you come back 4 years later and it looks exactly the same as it did before you did a treatment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that long-term commitment and how we're approaching that now. And I think that this is starting to, I think that people across the West are starting to think about this long-term commitment to invasive annual grass control. This was just a really complex slide, basically to prove the point that we're dealing with a plant that if you pull that individual annual grass up, it is dead. That plant is done. But we're dealing with a long-lived seed bank, and we're also dealing with complex interacting factors like weather, like soils, like grazing management and wildlife movements, all of those different things that can potentially impact the longevity and success of any individual treatment. I wasn't going to ask you guys to be able to memorize this complex diagram. So we focused on cheatgrass for a long time. And then in 2016, the new guys showed up. So until 2016, we did not know that we had self-sustaining populations of either Ventenata or Medusahead in the entire state of Wyoming or the entire Great Plains ecoregion, of which the eastern portion of Wyoming belongs. So all of this pinkish yellow shiny stuff that you see in this picture is this grass Ventenata. North African grass is another name. Wiregrass is another name. We've been doing some work as part of the Northeast Wyoming Invasive Grasses Working Group trying to understand the forage quality of this grass, and we know that it is much less than the perennial grasses depending on growth stage. As it starts to dry up and cure down and look like this, there's not much nutritional value. And then aside from just nutrient quality and content, palatability is very low. It means that the livestock and the wildlife just don't prefer to eat it, especially over the perennials. So when both of these two species were confirmed in Sheridan County within a few months of one another, some communication went back and forth between what has been called the Wyoming Cheatgrass Task Force, which is a state-level task force that was created by an MOU among state agencies, federal agencies, University of Wyoming, and others in the late 90s. And since it was a localized problem at that point in time, they pushed it back to the local level. And the Northeast Wyoming Invasive Grasses Working Group with the terrible acronym of NWIGWIG was formed in January of 2017. The key thing that I would like to point out just with this slide is all of the different partners that voluntarily came to the table and have contributed high levels of not only resources, but time, intellectual capacity, awareness, education, and other things. And it has led to some really interesting opportunities in that we've had a few private landowners who basically changed our knowledge about distribution of these species within about a 2-week period of time. Once they learned what they were looking at, they were calling every 2 or 3 days saying, we found some more, we found some more, we found some more. And so education is critically important. And engaging those landowners who really have the most at risk from these species is critically important. Weed and Pest, the whole suite of federal agencies, their conservation districts, nonprofit organizations, military organizations, and I would say industrial partners routinely sit around the table, not only to think about how we're going to obtain funding, but also to think through the strategy of how we're going to try to manage these species at a landscape scale. And it has led to some really interesting opportunities. As someone who's tied with an educational institution, there were a lot of questions about how these species were going to behave in our area that we didn't know about. And so we're not just going out and haphazardly implementing treatments across the landscape. We are using research to inform those decisions and also to understand the implications of those decisions. And while we're doing the research, we also cooperate with folks like Sheridan College. We engage students directly in that research. Some of those students are doing their cornerstone programs specifically tied to research to help make decisions and understand the impacts of these invasive grasses and the management strategies. To me, that's the model of cooperation from a land-grant university that we should be doing. And this is one example of how that happens across a number of multiple examples where it happens across the state. This is kind of where we are now. So this is very coarse scale to orient you. We're sitting right here in Sheridan. These maps were generated from intensive surveys, some aerial imagery, citizen science, folks calling in and reporting these species, and our number of partners identifying the species as a whole. Medusahead very much restricted to the area around Sheridan, and we went from not thinking we had Ventenata in 2016 to here we are in 2019, and if we kind of connect the dots around the places that we have confirmed it, over 1 million acres potentially. Now that is not continuous coverage, but that's just the distributional polygon. To keep this in perspective, and we were talking about early detection, rapid response a few moments ago, you might say 1 million acres, the horse has already left the barn, there's no way we can catch up. Think about it from the entire state that is still free that we think of these species. We've got an opportunity to prevent it from moving further into the state and minimizing those impacts across a larger scale. We'll spend some time potentially looking at both of these today. So this is a brief report out on some of the activities.
Representative Hunt has a question.
Real quick, sorry to interrupt, but with that split between those two areas, where did the Ventenata begin coming up in? Well, I guess first off, in which of those two bunches did it first appear? In Sheridan County or in Campbell?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt, I don't know that I can answer that question. Where we first found it was north and west of Sheridan County.
Okay.
And now the interesting story about Ventenata is there was actually a collection made by a botanist affiliated with the University of Wyoming in 1997, north and west of Sheridan. Collected, identified, put in Rocky Mountain Herbarium, and forgot about, essentially. And so we knew that it had been found here. What we did not know, and I think the thing that we all have to accept somewhat hesitatingly, is that many of us have probably been driving by it all this time and didn't know it. And so it took the identification of it. My complete suspicion, and I have no data to support this, I just want to make that very clear, is that one of the places that we seem to find Ventenata is in places that were had some coal bed methane development in the latest push. And it seems like that would hold the same here. I'm not assigning causality, I'm not assigning any kind of responsibility, but the disturbance with that highly intensive development that coincided potentially with the introduction of a species like this may be related. We don't know that. We will probably never know exactly where it came from. We are working with a researcher from Boise State University who's doing genetics on these species, and all we know is that we have the most common genotype of Ventenata in our area that is found further west. So if it had been like really special, we might be able to find out where it came from, but it is not. And so we're stuck with probably always wondering where the initial introduction probably occurred. That gap may be real, it may not be real. It may be part of a remnant of just lack of survey at this point in time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. My main curiosity out of that was just if there was any theory as to what caused that migration. I mean, where in Campbell County was it first discovered? Was that along a highway or interstate?
here. The first report was somewhat south of Gillette,
Yeah.
along a power line, I think. But there's so much infrastructure, it would be hard to pin down where it was.
Go ahead.
Representative Claus.
What part of the world do these two grasses come from originally, and how do they manage them there? I mean, is it at Southeast Asia or Africa, or do we know?
Mr. Chairman, it's a really interesting question that you ask. The pat answer for us is Eurasia. So a Mediterranean climate, we're not exactly sure where the initial Medusahead introduction arrived from. So here's the really interesting part of what you ask, is that Ventenata dubia, the exact species of Ventenata that we have, was actually petitioned as an endangered species in part of its native range in Western Europe. They're not problematic. And so somebody mentioned that they get introduced from one continent to another without their natural enemies. So in many cases, they're sort of well-behaved members of the community in their native area. And when they get introduced into a new continent, there are things that happen, and there's at least 16 different competing hypotheses for why they become problematic. But there's something that changes either in the species itself or in the susceptibility system to being dominated by that species, likely a combination of the two, that leads them to become invasive. Predominant flow of invasive species has followed the pattern of human settlement. So the former stand states here, much of our settlement came from that area. There are some North American species that have gone the opposite direction and become problematic invasives there too. But it's an astute question for which I don't think we have the answer.
I have a different question.
Go ahead.
On this particular map here, what are the little blue dots represent? Is that state land? And then what's the yellow as well?
Should put a legend on there. I apologize. The light blue dots,
Yeah,
the little squares would be state lands.
that's all state six.
Yellow would be BLM. Green is Forest Service. And I'm probably running way over time here. I apologize.
Oh, please proceed. Yeah.
But you can work through the summary here. You heard some information earlier, and we'll touch on this in the tour as well. There were some pretty large numbers as far as funding that had been dedicated to this working group. I will give a lot of credit to Sheridan County Weed and Pest and the other project partners in their dedicated efforts of obtaining grant funding to support this work that I think benefits the entire state and the entire region. And that's how much of this has occurred. And it's important to point out also that this working group, this specific project, is recognized as one of 2 national early detection rapid response pilot projects by the National Invasive Species Council. And so we have that distinction in Wyoming of being held up as an example of how to do this thing called EDRR. And whether it's successful or not remains to be seen. I will end with this, and I think this is just to reiterate some of the things that we talked about earlier. If it were easy, they would not be a problem. And so understanding this complex set of different interacting factors that we have to deal with, and then overlaying that with the socioeconomic perspective, makes it really difficult. And it's a huge challenge, or else we would not have spent all day talking about it. The opportunity to be proactive with some of these really problematic invasive species is not something that we have been able to do as much as we would have liked. Now, on one hand, that's a good thing because it means we're not receiving that many new species into the state. Or if we have, you heard some examples from Josh about how some of those very rapid responses prevented them from building up to population numbers where they were problematic. This opportunity in Northeast Wyoming provides us a chance to try to implement a strategic proactive management approach to preventing those, the next cheatgrass or the next leafy spurge or the next Canada thistle take your pick, that could have broad-reaching impacts to the agricultural and natural resources economy of the state. I apologize, that was longer than I intended. But thank you for, I'd say thank you for your commitment to being here today, and thank you for the opportunity to visit with you guys twice, even though one of these was unexpected, so.
Well, we certainly appreciate your presentation, all the work that everybody's done. It's good to hear consistently from multiple sources that we're doing okay here in Wyoming, but obviously there's always more that can be done. As you said, it's going to be a never-ending process, I'd imagine. So any questions, committee, before we get ready to go on the tour here? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Mr. Chairman, this is definitely not just a Wyoming problem, a regional problem. Do other states, I mean, Montana, Idaho, Washington, do they already have infestations, and are they dealing with it?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, yes. And so I would say to varying degrees in different states. And one of the reasons why I say we can be somewhat proactive is because it is, for these species in particular, it's new species for us. I think about Idaho and Eastern Oregon, and I think about Medusahead and Ventenata and the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres that they have already. Just wrapping their arms around the problem to begin to start to develop a landscape scale strategy is maybe a little bit more daunting. They are working on it, but they don't have quite the opportunity that we have, the unfortunate opportunity that we have that we're dealing with them here. I can say that state of Montana confirmed Ventenata presence in 9 counties last year, directly to the north of Sheridan. Now, is that biological spread? I don't think so. I think it's probably awareness that is spreading. So the problem is real, and it's something that many of us around the entire West are thinking through. And I think that's part of the reason for some of these initiatives like the Western Governors Association initiative around biosecurity and invasive species, is that they realize the potential long-term impacts of these species. And they also realize that in some cases we're kind of behind and we need to catch up.
Any further questions, committee? Great, Representative Hahn.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Not a question, but I would just like to thank Brian and everybody out there who works for Weed and Pest and who's been involved in this. For me personally, a year ago, this was not even on my radar. And then last July, I had the opportunity to come up here and take a flight with Brian and with Hale Redding and with Luke. And, so I just want to say thank you to you guys for bringing this to our attention. And so going forward, I don't know what, if anything, will come to fruition with the 2020 session, but just really appreciate you guys' diligence and your work and being the eyes and ears and footwork on the ground. So thank you very much for what you do and for your concern and diligence and the service to the state. So thank you.
Okay, well, committee, if we don't have any further questions, so this will be wrapping up our invasive species topics for this meeting. I imagine we'll definitely have at least one draft bill that we'll be looking at in Laramie, and I imagine we'll have this on the agenda in Laramie, as well as maybe some follow-up as we continue to digest the significant amount of information we've received here today from sources, state, local, federal level. We'll continue to engage, but it seems like the structures in place are perfectly adequate. We might have to work on the funding, though, as always. So any further questions, comments, committee members? Representative Larson, you're making some funny noises. Okay, well, now's the time.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to make a motion to reconsider our vote on our second motion from Senator Moniz on how we determine if legislation comes from this committee. And I'd like to have that be that both houses have to pass it affirmatively.
Okay, so looking to Josh, as far as reconsidering motions for rules, is that just a simple majority vote then, or Can we maybe get a, okay, yeah, I think the rules are that you have to do it at the same meeting as, that's what I'm thinking, okay. Okay, very good. Okay, so the motion is to, I guess, reconsider the portion of the decision that we made at the beginning of the meeting with the rules to make it, so, correct me if I'm wrong, Representative, but you want to make it so that it requires a majority of both chambers to sponsor legislation, and that's it. Okay, so the motion is to make that change. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Senator Moniz. Any discussion? Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, all right, Representative.
Mr. Chairman, wouldn't that change? Wouldn't we have to go back and revote on any motions we made today to make sure that?
No, it does not, because it's only deals with actually approving legislation for sponsorship as a committee. So it doesn't change. Once we have a draft bill in front of us, a simple majority will make amendments. It's a simple majority as we have to just move forward with a draft. This is only dealing with the actual decision to sponsor legislation as a committee going into the budget session. And that's it. So it wouldn't change anything we did here today. It just come into effect or play a role in the second and third meetings as we consider whether to make a final decision as to whether to sponsor that draft legislation or not. And that's it. So Representative Blake.
So this first vote is a vote to reconsider?
Yes, yeah, that's probably the proper way of doing it. Thank you. So, okay, so it's an upper, okay, so now that we understand, I believe that's basically an up or down vote. There's not much discussion. So we're going to basically vote to go ahead and open up that discussion again, and then we'll have that. So Representative Henderson, do you have a question on what we're voting on?
Just a point of order, sir. Don't you have to be, would it be appropriate to be on the prevailing side of the motion that we're trying to revoke?
Normally it would, but we didn't take a roll call vote.
Well, we did vote on the overall rules. And
Did you have a record of who was on?
The last part of that defaults to Mason, right?
What's that?
The last part, the last paragraph, if I read it right, it refers to Mason as our procedure.
Yes. So what's your?
So I'm asking if the gentleman is making, if you want to make a motion to revote, reconsider. It's my understanding you need to be on the prevailing side of the vote you're asking to reconsider.
Okay, well, I guess we'll ask Representative Larson how you voted. Were you on the prevailing side?
Mr. Chairman, I was not, but I would like to have the LSO's opinion.
Mr. Chairman, as you noted, we've looked at this a couple of times when this has come up in previous committees. For one, as you note, it wasn't a roll call vote, so it's hard to say. It's also not clear whether that rule applies to committees or just in the deliberative bodies themselves, the House and the Senate. So ultimately, probably your call as chairman.
Okay. Well, I have a sense of utility. I think we'll wait for somebody was on the prevailing side very briefly. As I said, this isn't, I don't see this as being a huge issue, but if somebody who was on the prevailing side wants to make that motion, reconsider, now be the time. Representative Tass.
Mr. Chairman, I will move that motion then.
Okay. All right, is there a second? Second by Senator Moniz. Okay, so all in favor of reconsidering the rules that, in that specific areas we discussed, please, we'll just go ahead and raise your hand. All those in favor of reconsideration. I have 8, is that correct? Okay, all those, well, that's a majority of the 14 present. So we are now reopening the rules that we discussed this morning. Is there a motion to amend the rules as, like I said, we've approved that we have 2 co-chairmen instead of a chairman or vice chairman, and that's it. So if there's any additional amendments, once again, the default being that you just need a simple majority of the quorum present to sponsor legislation, now would be the time to make that amendment.
So you're asking for a new amendment or to reconsider the amendment?
Just for a new amendment.
Okay,
if that.
I'll make an motion.
I'll second that.
Okay, and just to be clear, just for superficial, the motion is to require a majority of both chambers to officially sponsor legislation as a committee. And it's been moved by Senator Moniz and seconded by somebody. Representative Larson. Okay. Any further discussion on this matter? Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I never saw this in my first 8 years or so. And then all of a sudden it reared its ugly head. But, you know, we're a committee. If we pass this as a committee, it should go forward as a committee bill, the majority. And right, the House has more votes than the Senate. I get that. I graduated high school from Evanston High and I understand practical math. But I'm saying it kind of divides us. And when it divides us here at this level, that's what's been happening in the legislature recently. We're divided. And I think it's a bad move. And so I'll be a no vote.
Thank you, Representative. Any further discussion? I'd just like to say I'm probably going to end up voting the opposite of Representative Blake, but I do agree that this isn't really that big of a deal. We do work together on this committee. When we go to our respective chambers, I expect that we'll continue to work as a team. We're not going to immediately start stabbing each other in the back. And really there's only frankly, one standing committee where that happens. And I don't see the need for that there's no need for it to spread. So no matter what happens here today, and hopefully this will be the last time we discuss it. In fact, I think the way I understand it, since it's on the agenda for today, this probably will be the only time we discuss it. We just move on. Like I said, as a practical matter, the only reason I'm voting for this is because we are going to the budget session. We have to be cognizant of the bills we put forward if it doesn't take time. But once again, you know, if you ask me tomorrow, maybe I'll have a different opinion. So that being said, we'll go ahead and say, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Okay, I got 9. Is that correct, Josh? All those opposed, please raise your hand. And I got 5 then. I went to Douglas High School. I believe that makes 14. So, okay. So now that we've got past that, and we can. Well, I was going to go over the logistics of the tour, but now I want to talk about the logistics for this evening. So we were supposed to be at a certain place at a certain time this evening, and that was 6 o'clock. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Luke Sander with the Sheridan County Weed and Pest. So the plans are now the bus is out back in lot G. If you go up the stairs and head out to the left, it'll be back there waiting. Brian's getting a university vehicle as well. So I'll be on the bus. If you have any questions about stuff on the way out there, feel free to grab me. Once we get out on site, should be about a 20-minute drive. It'll be a small little hike, a couple 100 yards, and we'll be walking through one of the treatment areas that we treated last year. And then you'll see a new Medusahead site that has not been treated yet. So you'll see the comparison. Should be quick and dirty. Load back up in the bus, come back here, hopefully be here between 5 and 5:30. And then at Luminous Brew House on Broadway Street downtown, starting at 6, we will have a small get together. Hetty's Pizza will be there. You guys are welcome to order whatever pizza you want. The Weed and Pest Council is going to pick it up. And then Dave Kinski is also going to buy everybody around too. So that's going to be from 6 to 9. You're more than welcome, and I'd love to see you.
So what is the address? Do we have an address?
Yeah, so Luminous Pizza, or Luminous Brew House, I'm sorry. 504 Broadway Street. And if you just put it in your Google or whatever too, it comes up as Luminous Brew House.
And a question for Alice. So do we have an opportunity to leave our stuff here if we're going to come back from the tour? Can we leave our stuff that we might want to take home and be able to access it? And also simultaneously, will it be secure if we leave it here overnight? Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. Well, thank you. Go ahead. Okay. Thank you very much. So we are adjourned for today. We'll meet back at the bus and just